Hi. I don't see the camera on me, but I'm here in the studio. I'm Gary Adcock here for the Zacuto podcast with my good friend Joe Bogacz from Canon U.S.A. here. On Skype today, we're talking about HDR, and we're going to discuss some things. But let's go around and just see who all's with us today. Juan Salvo, jump in here and tell us who you are and what you do.
Hey, Gary, how's it going?
Good, sir. So what do you do? What are you?
My name is Juan Salvo. I'm a colorist in New York City. You're in my studio at the Color Piece. And happy to join you guys about HDR. Happy days, Juan's.
Yeah, so Juan's a colorist in New York, was actually here in Chicago yesterday for the Black Magic Conference. Bram, where are you at this year?
Yeah, I'm in Atlanta right now and at the FSI headquarters, and I run Flanders Scientific, and we make HDR monitors, among other things.
Rob Carroll, let's introduce yourself and tell us who you are.
Hey, good morning. I'm with Dolby. I'm responsible for all the content solutions related to Dolby Vision, which is our HDR distribution system. And glad to be here this morning. Thanks.
And last but not least, Joe Bogacz here in the studio. Joe, tell us about who you are, and let's get started here.
Okay. Well, I'm Joe Bogacz. I'm been with Canon now for 29 and a half years, so I've seen a lot. I started off with imaging back in the days before Mac and Windows had a GUI, so I'm right from the beginning. At the moment, for the last few years, I've been involved with the reference display business that Canon's involved in.
So let's talk about HDR. What is HDR? And Juan, I want you to start on this because as a colorist, it affects you. But let's pull up the first slide and let's just talk about amongst ourselves, what is HDR and how do we, as individuals, make HDR more popular? So
well,
are you there?
HDR is a standard for displaying high dynamic range images on sets. So it's if you think of a traditional TV as being a limited set of dynamic ranges from 0 nits to nits, the new standards go up to 4,000 nits and up. You're seeing consumer sets at around 1,000 nits. And what that means is just in effect, it means we can get much brighter images, much more dynamic, more of a wider color gamut, more colorful images.
Yeah, we're having a little problem catching up with you, Juan. Bram, let's go to you and talk to us about HDR monitoring on set and how we're going to go for it and what this really means for a lot of us.
Yeah, so I think one of the big challenges has been... Oh, we got Rob over there.
Oh, you got it right.
So, certainly one of the challenges in HDR up until this point has been kind of the barrier to entry of the display device. So we've captured images with less dynamic range, with high dynamic range capable cameras for quite some time. The monitor that is a challenge, of course. And there are more display devices that are starting to become available on the market. And that happens in both post and in production applications. And the production applications, one of the challenges is how you go from monitoring log to PQ for HDR.
Well, so what we're really talking about is making sure we have all the consumer side. So let's pull up some of the content where we can find HDR content and where we are. We've got a few slides on that. And Rob, why don't you talk about Dolby's vision for all of this? Because you're pretty much the premium content provider or delivery system for HDR for most users. What's the advantage for all of this?
Well, the biggest thing is in the first time since we started delivering images to the home, we've got a complete end-to-end ecosystem that's digital. And the nice thing about a digital end-to-end ecosystem is we can finally deal with the fact that every playback system is not exactly the same. In the days of HDR and even before HD, colors always fought they could not get their creative content delivered to the end user system. The classic is you go to grandma's house and grandma's watching TV and all the people are green because their TV's set up. And the nice thing about an end-to-end digital ecosystem is we can now send control metadata to actually set the TV up or set the display device up. And that's really important because now we're going from things like phones and tablets and TVs to digital signage in public areas, where we want to get that creative intent, to get that absolute high fidelity image presented in front of the audience. And HDR gives us the ability to improve the images and end-to-end ecosystem. Metadata being delivered to the display devices gives us the ability of delivering healthy artistic intent to the audience.
Joe, you're nodding your head.
Yep.
Go into it.
Okay. Well, there's actually two main systems for delivering HDR. One is the Dolby Vision, the PQ, which is completely standardized by SMPTE. The other one was developed by NHK and BBC, which is hybrid log gamma, or HLG. And that really, the HLG was really meant for a live broadcast. When you take a look at the impetus of what that was meant for, when you talk to the BBC, one of their highest rated shows, one of the shows that gets the millions of people watching, is cricket. And that's shown around the world, but they're not showing, just in the US or Britain or Canada. It's shown in places like the Philippines and India and everything else that still has the CRT TVs, and they're not going to have the PQ system quite yet. So they have to come up with something that are able to watch on regular standard dynamic range televisions that are out there, the millions that are out there, but also be able to do HDR at the same time. So at the moment, they're two coexisting systems.
So to the group now, when we're talking about HLG, how does that affect us, and how does that divine thing? Because we're actually now seeing the benefits of HLG on conventional broadcasts.
Well, on things like sports, with live broadcasts.
Like live broadcasts.
So when you're really talking about a production, as in a TV show, an episodic, a movie, you really are talking about something like the PQ system, because it's mathematically accurate.
Right.
The HLG system isn't mathematically accurate. So, for instance, a live broadcast might be shooting in log in the cameras, go log all the way through the truck and the system, and at the end, they'll be recording PQ for archival purposes, and then broadcasting HLG for the regular world.
Wow.
So they are really two different uses, if you will, of HDR.
So Juan, go ahead.
Yes, sir. I was just going to jump in and say that the HLG is more of, like Joe said, much more for broadcast or sports broadcast, live content, previewing on set, where PQ, which means HDR10, HDR10 Plus, and Dolby Vision, which is most popular, are much more for very crafted and developed looks, where you're really honing in exactly what your response is going to be.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And see, that's important for people, because they need to understand what it is. One of the questions I want to bring up, and maybe Bram, you in this, is 4K always, we talk a lot about 4K and HDR. Is HDR always 4K? And is 4K always HDR?
No.
Thanks, Bram.
They don't have to be tied together.
Yeah.
So you can definitely do HDR without 4K, and you can certainly do, and we have done for quite some time, without HDR. But certainly when we talk about kind of leading edge technologies these days, you do see those things typically go. So you have high dynamic range, you have wide color, 4K and UHD. Usually combined, especially when you get into some of the modern display device side of things, also capture side of things. It'd be very rare to use a HD-only camera to capture content that's set for HDR deliverable. So those things do tend to kind of go in hand in hand.
Yeah. Ryan, can you pull up slide 7 while Joe elaborates here? He's got this. And it's interesting.
Well, to go on with what Bram was saying, is that the international engineering standard is that HDR can either be HD or 4K. So you can do either one and still be compliant within the standard. The tests that we've done, you really have 3 separate components that work together to give the best picture. One is the HDR, the actual luminance value of the picture. One is 4K, which is the resolution, and the third one is the color space. Going from P3 to 2020, and originally, of course, the television sets were 709. So you've increased the color space. You get all 3, and it's like looking through a window. So The best scenario is to use all three.
But now we're in a place where everybody does HDR everywhere. I mean, I've got HDR on my phone, and this is open for everybody here, because now we have HDR on our phone, and people don't understand this is not HDR for motion pictures and television is different than HDR for stills. And it's a simple process, but it seems to be much more complicated than everybody thinks it is. Here's somebody's. Go ahead.
Yeah, Gary, I was just going to say, I think people often confuse two sort of different things. The idea of HDR as a video format, where we're actually expanding the display range, and HDR in the still world, which was all about compressing captured image. So taking a big exposure or multiple exposures, compressing them down into SDR. And both the HDR terminology precedes the use in stills, precedes the use in video, where we're now expanding the range. But it's literally the opposite thing, basically.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Bram, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely different on the video side of the equation. I think as Juan kind of touched on there, we're actually kind of expanding that end palette when you talk about HDR video. When we talk about HDR photography, we're really cramming everything down into essentially an SDR container still. So with HDR, you are getting a much more lighter image, and it is a different ball game with that workflow.
So let's talk about the acquisition. Joe, you're here in the studio. You work for Canon. Let's just start with you on the acquisition side, because do we always have to work in RAW to be in HDR? Do we always have to shoot log?
Let me go one step back and talk about color space a little bit.
Okay.
And so what people don't realize, and I think this is a general misconception, I've seen it a few different times, that people take a look at that nice big color diagram that you see printed on the page and all the time, and it's not a two-dimensional image, it's a three-dimensional image. And so when you start talking about color spaces, if you want to think about Rec 709, which is standard for for 50 years or so, it was, let's say, the size of a tennis ball. And then you take a look at P3, which is the movie standard for color space. It was maybe the size of a baseball. And then you take a look at 2020, it's the size of a basketball. And it really is a three-dimensional. So as you get more color space, your reds will look more vibrant. It's not just brighter, it's more vibrancy in all the colors. So, you know, roses, all those things. So those are big advantages for the bigger color space. Now I've forgotten your whole question.
Well, I'll lead into it, because it's actually I'm gonna pass it to Rob. But Rob, when people, do they really understand what they see when they're looking at HDR? I mean, one of the things I like to remind people about is that beyond about 25 or 35 feet, you can't tell the difference between 4K and HD. But across a store, you can see an HDR set, and it changes the way you look at everything. And that's kind of a different way to think about it. And Rob, as the Dolby rep here, tell me how much this has changed the way people are buying televisions.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think one of the things that is interesting is that people do tend to buy televisions based on the image they see in the store. Right?
Oh yeah.
And so when you can create an image that from across the room looks different and looks better, people are going to gravitate towards that type of TV. I think to go back to what Joe was talking about too, is that one of the things we have to understand with HDR is that additional contrast range is resolution. And so you actually get more detail and more depth in your image as you can increase that contrast range. And that is independent of spatial resolution, like HD or UHD. The other thing is with higher brightness levels, and a lot of people get confused about the brightness component of it, because the brightness component of HDR is every bit as part of the volume that Gary was talking about, getting the color you want in that color volume, as much as it is getting the contrast range. So we often get questions around, will we ever need a 10,000 lump? Will we ever need to use that full PQ value? And it's not really about whether you use it or whether it's going to be viewable by a audience. It's about having that palette, having that range that you need in order to get the image you want in the component of the image, like the rows, or in one case that came up with it was a movie that was taking place on Mars. They had to get a red color that they just could not get in SDR. But getting that color volume exactly where you want it in the content.
Well, and you know, we talk about HDR all the time. We forget about the other half of that phrase is wide color gamut is part of this.
Exactly.
Bram, tell us about how, you know, from a manufacturing side, how you guys are building tools to do things like Canon is to work on set to be able to do this and be able to handle what's going on in these productions.
Yeah, so I think that one thing that we see people doing that I think is very useful on set is, you know, you capture log and you go straight into a conversion product. The FSHDR is a good example of something that can convert from log to PQ. Or you have some cameras now even that have a direct PQ out that do a log to PQ conversion. That allows you to really preview the HDR very well. You can also combine that with real-time SDR preview. And it's interesting when you look at SDR versus HDR. SDR, the thing that you're constantly kind of battling with is that you have to make a decision between saturation and luminance. So you can't have the really bright and the really saturated color. One of the two kind of has to give. And that's kind of the interesting thing in trying to switch the SDR to the HDR is where you make those trade-offs to the HDR version of the content.
Yeah.
Juan, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just point out that I think the Rec 2020 spec and this very wide color gamut is much more theoretical than practical at this point. When we're actually doing creative work in HDR, we're often aiming for that P3 color space because there's just a much more kind of approachable color space. A lot of consumer devices can actually hit those colors.
Right.
One thing that's beautiful about the sort of HDR specs in Dolby Vision and HDR 10 Plus and 10 is that you can basically grade in a way that it can get adapted to the display, to what the display is capable of. And so we can aim for certain colors, and we often do. Sometimes the sets are able to keep up with those aims, sometimes they're not. The HDR 10 standards allow for the sets to sort of elegantly finesse their capability. And that's one thing that's really appealing and really beautiful to us as colorists, and it's the DPs, I think.
So something that Juan mentioned twigged me, which was when he talked about you know, really finishing in P3 type of color space. And going back to your question that I finally remembered about actually shooting, you know, the camera side. You know, really what you want to do is you want to have the best possible capture, because you don't know what's going to happen a year from now, or 3 years, or 4 years from now, or 5 years. So on the capture side, you want to try and capture the widest color space, because it doesn't affect the file size. So you want to try and be in 2020. You want to try and capture the biggest bit depth that you possibly can. And that does affect file size, but you know, hard drives are relatively inexpensive. And you know, you have to pick the lenses, you have to pick the camera. You know, those are all personal creative choices. But really, you have to try and get the best possible signal out of the camera and record it. When Bram was talking about the you know, the SDR versus HDR, I think the best example is that when you watch, let's say, a football game, and you see the sky in the background, it's completely white, and no sky is white.
No.
You know, and so you know exactly that's it's SDR hard clip,
right,
as your famous words go. So that's a good example of what SDR is versus HDR, which you should be able to see lots of detail in the clouds and the sky, and actually see a blue sky, and still see the detail.
Hey Gary, I'm just gonna butt in here if that's okay. Sorry, I'm hearing myself a little bit, so I apologize if I'm running over you.
No, you're right.
John Pace here says that this is bringing up one of his biggest gripes, that there are still no affordable true HDR monitors available to the public, anything under $2,000.
Yeah, there is.
And then we've got a specific question here from Rathan, which maybe we can run into, is do we need to have a raw sauce for HDR? Because, sorry, I have an accent, raw. It's a difficult word for me. Sauce for HDR, because now there are a lot of small log cameras.
Well, the first one is, yes, there are televisions below $2,000 that do HDR. You know, the perfect example is the Dolby compatible sets from TCL. Great company, Chinese company producing Dolby monitoring systems. I mean, LG, Samsung, Vizio all have sets under $2,000 in the HDR.
But I think it's like anything when the manufacturer starts, or all the manufacturers starting with HDR, as the volume increases, as the technology goes forward, as the engineering goes forward, the cost is going to drop.
Well, and we're going to talk about that as we close out in a little bit too, because
that's the answer to $2,000.
Jump in.
He may also have meant professional devices.
Well,
which there really aren't. I mean,
there really aren't, and that's a good point, because there aren't really professional devices that are mainstream affordable for anything other than a high-end production.
Right.
Well, but that's what rentals for.
Yes, that's what rentals is for. The entry-level 17-inch display we have is $12,000 US. So that's the entry-level price for HDR.
And that brings up some interesting comments about this. As we start talking production, and Bram, if you have any comments, dive in here. But now we're getting to the point where we've got people shooting log on set. They asked a question if there was a special sauce for log. There's not. All the cameras are different. They all define their own log or how they handle data differently. Being able to do the output, that's what we're talking about here, is the output controls on all of this. But let's talk about some of the gotchas on set, the things that are going to bite people as we start working towards this HDR future. What can we do in camera, on set, for the future to be able to control this? I'm going to actually start with you, Joe, and then I'm going to go to Bram and then see what Juan has to say and close that on.
I think we actually have some slides for this.
Oh, we have some slides, don't we? We should have some slides.
The gotcha slides.
The gotcha slides.
Yeah. So the first gotcha is the lighting.
Yeah.
So whether you really, because HDR is not only about the brightness, it goes into the depths, the blacks, the shadows. So are you going to have cables in the background? Are you going to have all those little things that you're never have to worry about in a regular SDR production? And then, so that's the first.
Well, it's makeup. It's all things. It's clothing. It's everything. I mean,
absolutely everything.
And that's something that people going into HDR have forgotten about until they get into post.
Yep. And then the second gotcha is the mixed lighting sources, the actual degrees Kelvin. So in regular television production, if you had a little practical light at the back, which is a desk lamp or something like that, it really doesn't show up that much because it's more of a blend. In HDR, you start seeing that is a hugely different color temperature than your main lighting.
Wow.
And then the third one is that your shadows are. I think I might get them out of order. The third one is that which is the next slide, is the shadows.
Right.
So in SDR, when you have shadows, the SDR is lower resolution than HDR. So the shadow is actually, even though it sort of looks like a hard shadow, it is a nice even feather.
Right.
But in HDR, you're going to get a hard edge. So you have to do that. The other one, the last one, is that on a subject, if you have two lights towards you, if you've got one at 100%, one at 85%, it's close enough. You won't really see the difference. In HDR, you see that difference. So all these little things that you can just gloss over and you're moving on and you're just shooting will come to bite you. And this is one of the reasons why both Bram and myself are really pushing for the HDR monitoring on set. You're really saving yourself.
So I'm going to, Bram, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sensor clipping is a thing.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
And I think a lot of people shooting for SDR deliverables have almost forgotten to get these cameras that the 18 stops of range, and you got so much highlight range there to pull from and post. You stop thinking about that. When you get to HDR, and I've seen that. To be fair, it wasn't originally shot for HDR, but people trying to repurpose materials shot when the were the only thing on their mind, and see colors kind of work with and go. Sensor clipping. It's been a while since I've seen sensor clipping, and so I think that's a big consideration.
So I'm going to jump to Juan. You're breaking up a little bit there, Bram. Juan, so how often do you really come across multiple colored lights in the same shot and to screw you up? And that could be something in a low-end production, because people grab light sources from different reasons.
Oh, yeah.
And different manufacturers' light sources read different ways.
Yep.
How does that affect you in post coloring this stuff?
Well, often actually I see that used as a stylistic decision, as a creative decision. So having mixed color lighting in an environment is a kind of creative choice. I think
but what if it's a mistake? What if it's not a creative
that's
choice?
coming up here over and over is that HDR really does increase the need and the importance of doing color as a post process, of like really analyzing how do you want this image to actually look? How far into the shadows do you want to read? How do you want this mixed lighting to work? How much of a difference do you want between these sorts of colors or these sorts of highlights, or those choices become very conscious choices.
Go ahead.
And of course, one of the things is, as you're shooting, the famous line is, well, we'll fix it in post. It becomes a lot of one's time to fix it in post if it's not the creative intent. The idea is that on set, you should be able to see the creative intent. We have one show that is using 2 of our displays on, we have several shows using our displays, but one show particularly is using 3 of our displays. And what they're seeing on set, they've filmed enough of the episodes that they're now watching in post. And what they see on set is what they're seeing in post in finishing. And they're extremely happy, because that's, of course, is keeping the creative intent all the way through the line.
Well, that's what continuity is about. That's how workflows are built.
Yes.
So, and that's important in all of this, is maintaining consistency in how we work through the future on this. Let's talk about...
Hey, Gary, we've just got a little comment while we're on this topic.
Sure.
From Trevor Pinocchi, who says they should also be doing proper white balance on set. It will save the colorist a lot of work.
Yes.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
That should be a statement.
I'll jump
every
in.
production.
Jump in, Juan.
For most colorists, the color balance is the easiest adjustment you can make. So that's not a huge time suck. I know it can be a little distracting in post when you've got some misbalanced shots or whatever. But exposure and color balance tend to be pretty quick and easy adjustments, assuming that we have either raw or good log exposure, right? So that's where wrong when exposure becomes really important. Like clipping becomes really dangerous when you're with HDR.
The other side, when you're talking about production, because we've got Juan, the colorist, when you're going from acquisition, you're on camera, you're on set, you're watching it, you're saying, this is great. And let's say your color balance, going back to that color balance question, then you've got editorial who's watching it, and maybe the director's watching it, but the cinematographer's not there. And they're seeing this off-color image all the way, and eventually that becomes the master image.
Well, we see that on commercials all the time. It's like somebody's like, dude, why didn't they ever grade that?
But as it goes through, you're better off starting with editorial and why people watching dailies, trying to be the closest it possibly can be to what the creative intent is.
Yeah, which I think it also depends on the level of production.
Yeah.
So some productions can afford to have dailies and DITs and do that whole process, and some can't. And it's true, though, a real hazard is falling in love with the offline. Becomes a real problem, actually. When we get to the actual finishing stage, where we can fix some of these things, people are like, I've gotten used to seeing it this way. It doesn't look right now.
Yeah, which to me is one of the defeating parts in all of this, where people they don't pay attention to the fact that, oh, gee, why didn't you fix that? So let's close out with just... Can you bring up the slides on some of the devices that we can do this? This is some of the content that Dolby supplied to us, and it's kind of interesting because people need to understand exactly. I mean, here are content providers of who's providing content, and you look at that, that's a pretty big list of companies, and we start realizing, like, the slides we showed up either, it's thousands of hours, it's hundreds of hours on Vidview and Amazon Prime, and then thousands of hours on iTunes and Netflix, and we've got all of this, and you look at the content partners and everyone else that's distributing this kind of content. We've gotten to the point where we live with HDR on our phones, and it's changing the way we work. And this is a fundamental change in how we're going to view video content or content delivered to us on our devices for the rest of our lives. We started in film, we moved away from it, we got bad black and white television, we came back, we went back to film, we went digital, came back again, and now we're in a situation where we can go to the future, and it's here. And it's beautiful. So what's the next step here?
I think the next step is really, if I can jump in, is really the education part. you know, you have said, and I agree with you 100%, this is a fundamental change of how we look at images. And it's not a, oh, well, you know, I'm just going to shoot HDR today and not, you know, I can just do it. People have to study. People have to do tests. People have to really work at this to do good HDR.
To do good HDR.
And that's what it should be. If you're being hired, if you're a professional, if you're making your money from it, you should be doing a good job.
Well, and you know, this falls on the colorists and the camera guys and the colorists and the people in production, but also it's also on the delivery content. It's like, how are you handling the content for delivery? Are you sending it to YouTube? Is it going to Facebook? You know, are you delivering in cinema in the theaters? Are you cutting to Blu-ray? It depends on how you deliver your content. Right. Bram, anything you want to add on this? We lost him. Juan?
Yeah, if I'm not, I'm frozen. I'm not frozen. Okay.
Nope. That's not,
yeah. I would just say that, yeah, it's interesting to see how companies like Netflix are driving this content forward.
That's an understatement.
For, you know, content to be delivered, for example, in Dolby Vision, and they basically derive everything out from there, and that's really a concept.
Well, and that brings up a philosophy that Dolby's brought to us. And Rob, please jump in on this. But your philosophy was build for the future. I mean, that's why PQ is set to 20,000 nits. It's why the spec is set that way, because you're building for something, understanding how much farther in the future we have to look to do this.
Yeah, yeah. And I do have.
Yeah, I would say that if you look at the standards that have been set by various standards organizations, specifically around Rec 2020 and SMPTE 2084 with PQ. You know, both those standards are set at the visual limits of human perception. So, you know, we've got room to move and we've got room to expand. And one of the things that I think is important with this idea of HDR is, unlike the standard definition to high definition or ultra high definition switches, HDR is a progressively expanding of the dynamic range and the color volume from SDR. And so it's not a step function. It's not that you're either in SDR or you're in HDR. It's just that we've taken what we were with SDR and we've expanded the color gamut and the contrast ratio, and now you've got a bigger palette. And deliver your story, deliver your content, deliver your images in the appropriate way you need to deliver it within that palette. And we will use that to maintain your intent, the end device.
So let's talk about some of the places where, you know, normal people can find HDR. Other than, you know, there's the Dolby Cinema at AMC, so you can go see it in the theater. And if you haven't seen a Dolby projected, a motion picture projected in Dolby Cinema, there's nothing like it.
Right. Yep, and now Sony I think it was just last week, announced that they have a new series of televisions for the fall that that will be able to see a Netflix flag on the signal, and disable all the crazy controls, and really make it so that the creative intent comes through. And this is something that the cinematographers have been asking for years and years and years
since film.
Exactly. That the home viewer sees the creative intent of the production. And this is the first set of televisions that will be able to do that, because you've got the PQ, you've got the Netflix flag that tells the TV to turn off all the controls and just have it as a PQ, the best image possible, the creative intent. And I think that's a great step forward.
So Bram, where do you see your HDR content at?
Directly on my TV. So
you're like the rest of us. So it's Amazon, Roku.
Yeah, you don't just internet connection and hook it up to Netflix is what I'm watching, and it works beautifully.
Yeah. I have a little different in that I don't have a TV set, but I have a 110-inch screen and a projector, so I have a full theater, and it does look great.
Hey, Gary.
Yes, ma'am.
We've got kind of a little interesting conversation going on here that sort of maybe spikes things in a different direction. John 68Z says, isn't the whole process of HDR extremely energy inefficient? Can the planet handle such energy abuse? I don't know if there's such a thing as green filmmaking, but maybe he's talking about more about the individual.
Actually, it's an interesting comment, because people don't think about this, because they assume because the televisions are brighter, it's generating more energy.
Yeah.
It's consuming more energy, and technically it's not. Because of the way televisions are designed, they actually have programmable zones where, as you know, the running joke with Joe and I did, the lightsaber passes through. Only the area of the laser lightsaber are the only things that hit complete brightness. The other interesting thing about this fact is television sets, the consumer sets that we're talking about, actually use less power in HDR than they do in conventional, and certainly a lot less than the tube setting next to it.
Yes, exactly.
So,
and also, when you're talking about the actual filmmaking process itself, things are moving from incandescent lights to LED lights.
Right.
So your whole footprint, if you will,
toxic processing,
exactly, is completely gone.
So if you look at it in the States, that yes, it's brighter and all this kind of thing, what we're doing is we're removing the antiquity of our industry, driving it to much more energy efficient, much more conservative things that are much more in line with the environmental needs of the world today.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, these old CRTs that sat next to me, these things are full of toxic materials.
Yep.
A lot of toxic materials.
Yeah.
Or even the plasmas,
or plasma,
or the old LCDs.
Oh yeah.
You know, much more energy consumption.
So we're actually, our move to HDR is actually helping to facilitate, to hang a little bit more onto the planet, even though we're asking people to buy new content and do new things. Rob, I'm going to start you off with the last word here. We're getting kind of close to the end. And any comments, anything you want people to take from this, anything you want people to know?
Yeah, I think since this is probably very much a cinematographer audience, you know, the cameras, the equipment we've been shooting with for years have always been able to capture higher dynamic range than we've been able to play back. And so now's the time to start pushing your artistic desire, your artistic intent, to get your story across the way you want it. And really encourage people to lean in, become more educated in how HDR is created and delivered, and start building a wide content library that is delivering HDR to the audiences worldwide.
So bigger, wider content. Joe, you can go next.
Okay. I really think that from a manufacturing standpoint, which is what you're doing when you're on set, from an acquisition standpoint for actually doing it, the cinematographers, the DITs, all have to start learning the craft of HDR.
Right.
You know, the cameras themselves, exactly what Rob was saying, you know, you want to try and capture the biggest possible, most wonderful image that you can. And then from there, the colorist, the editor, everybody will take it from there. But you have to be so careful with lighting, you have to be so careful with everything you're shooting now.
Bram, your last takes.
Yeah, I think in talking about this specific crowd that we're talking to today, what's important to know is just how much more detail you do get in the lowlights. So I do see people who are working with HDR that have gotten quite good at you know, protecting for the highlights, but people forget that, you know, 50% of your code values are in 100 nits or less in that same old SDR type range. So taking care of shadows is, I think, such a big part of this. It's something that everybody should be mindful of going forward.
Wow, that's a good comment.
Yeah. Hey, Bram, while we're on you just saying goodbye, we had a question here. Can Bram say when they're going to release an affordable HDR monitor, which is obviously relative, but do you have anything in the works that you want to talk about?
$45,000 is affordable, isn't it? Yep.
Finishing suite.
So to that end, I mean, something that we've tried to do is our regular $4,000 and $3,500 17-inch PM series lineup. We have something called HDR Preview. It is definitely not on HDR monitoring. It'll give you kind of rough normalization. It's kind of like having a D-log on a standard signal when you're monitoring a log signal. We have something like that for preview as well. It gives you a normalized looking image and allows you to at least see if you're checking for your highlights and your lights correctly. So that's what I would encourage people who are on a tight budget to consider for production. And then for finishing, if you want to finish at these high have a contrast ratio, making yourself as future-proof as possible is important. time just mean a little bit of an investment if you want to do it right.
Yeah, and affordable monitoring is the problem for everybody, and it's not. It's still an issue. It's going to stay an issue. You know, there's no way around it. And again, part of it's just the panel cost. But
the panel cost and quite frankly the volume. You know, for what you're going to sell in professional equipment. Professional equipment is never inexpensive.
See, and that's the thing that people forget about it. And before I go to Juan, I'm just going to say this because it's like people forget. It's like, okay, so the production market is fairly small compared to all of these. So if we're doing this in a production market, there's only a limited number of sets they're going to sell. They're only going to hit a certain price point.
Right. And as I said, you know, we've started up with a 17-inch display that's around $12,000. On all of our displays, we've got something called an HDR toolkit. One of them is HDR metering, which puts up a color on top of every different nit value. So even though you're not seeing the 1,000 nits or 2,000 nits or 3,000 nits, you can tell the mathematical code values
of what it is.
So you can understand where the exposure is sitting.
So Juan, we're going to close out on you after we talked about code nit values on monitors and all this kind of stuff because
I love code nit values.
As the colorist, you're the last guy to touch the stuff. And you need to, I mean, it comes down to what you can produce and what can be delivered by the person finishing your product.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, to touch on the great points that Joe made and that Bram made a little bit, that really, to me, the defining characteristic of HDR, we talk about the highlights and how bright it gets, but really the defining characteristic is how clear and defined you can dig into shadows, how well resolved those shadows are. You know, we think about sort of brightness in HDR displays, but really the big thing is contrast, right? It's all about really how deep and dark can you get while you're maintaining those highlights, specular highlights. So I really would just re-up the point that I made, which is think about where your exposure is, think about exposing for shadows. You may want to expose a little bit brighter, get it down in post a little bit, just to get that detail and capture enough information in the shadows, because you're really going to be able to see into those. I think the other great thing about HDR is metadata and consistency. We talked a little bit about how Netflix is sort of driving HDR delivery. Dolby has done this, HDR 10, HDR 10 Plus is doing this. We really have the ability to tie metadata to the image that tells the viewer and the screen what it's supposed to look like. We can get more consistency out of displays. So the DPs, I would say, don't be afraid, because I know one of the big fears for DPs is they're losing control of the image, they're losing control of the creative intent. HDR actually gives you more control over the image, more control over the content, have more consistency. You're gaining that. You're not losing control, gaining consistency.
Awesome.
Perfect ending.
So, Rachel, take us out.
Yes, thank you everybody for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to watch more episodes. Next week we will have Philip Bloom back on the show, so he and Steve can critique and discuss some web videos and their show critics. We will see you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.